Is left-handed knitting actually a thing? Well, it turns out it's a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. Hi, my name is Taylor, and today we are talking about left-handed knitting. Now, I am a right-handed individual, and I want to be clear about one thing, and that is what this video is and what this video isn't. And that is two things, but I want to be clear about them. This is not me pretending to speak from the lived experience of a left-handed person who knits. This is me looking into a question, reading what other left-handed knitters have to say about their experience, comparing that with what I already know about how knitting works mechanically, and trying to make sense of where the confusion actually comes from. This all started when a patron of mine came to me and shared a recent experience. She told me that she had apparently opened a can of worms on Reddit by asking about being left-handed and knitting lefty, which, always is a promising start. She said that there was a lot of debate around whether or not handedness was even really a thing in knitting to begin with, what actually counts as left-handed knitting, and what approach people ought to take. Then she followed up and said that she was feeling very overwhelmed by the notion of mirroring other knitting patterns, which essentially just means taking a knitting pattern and reversing everything, almost as if you were to take the knitting pattern and run it through a mirror machine where it comes out where you're no longer working from right to left, you're working from left to right. And that's not only across a chart, but also from the direction that the stitches come from the left needle onto the right, as opposed to the right needle onto the left. And you can see how that would be overwhelming to think that that is the approach one should take if they are left-handed. And she ultimately said that she was just going to try leading with her right hand needle and see where that goes. And that caught my attention immediately because I happen to have two left-handed people in my own life right now learning to knit, and both of them are knitting just from the right needle to the left needle. Neither of them are mirroring anything. And the more I looked into this, the more it seemed to me that the phrase left-handed knitting is much more complicated and complex than it seems on the surface. Okay, so the first thing that seems useful to establish is this. Knitting patterns are not really written around handedness. They are written around direction. Most knitting patterns assume that the stitches are moving from the left needle to the right needle. And as you're looking at this on the screen, this is actually your left and this is my left. But okay, for you at home, from the left needle to the right needle. That is the basic orientation that most knitting patterns are describing. So from a purely mechanical standpoint, what seems to matter most is not which hand is dominant in your daily life, but rather the direction the stitches are traveling and the orientation that the pattern assumes. And that distinction feels important because it already kind of explains why this gets a little bit more muddy than people expect at first glance. One question I kept circling around is if knitting really does lean right-handed in some way, where exactly is that bias living? Is it in the hand that leads the needle? Is it in the hand managing the yarn? Or is it less about one motion being objectively more dominant and more about which motion becomes standardized first in the process? And from where I'm sitting, I do not think that is an especially easy question to answer, at least not cleanly, because knitting is already a two-handed activity for most people and generally speaking. Different styles of knitting also distribute that labor differently. In one style, the yarn is managed in the right hand. We call that English style knitting in most cases. In another, it is managed in the left, and that is typically referred to as continental knitting. One hand may lead the working motion more clearly and more visibly in one style, while the other hand is doing more of the stabilizing and feeding in another. So the more I thought about this, the more I realized, or actually it was like the less convinced I was, that the real right hand bias lives in one big heroic dominant motion. It seems more likely that the clearer bias shows up around the overall system of the motion. That would be the conventions, the chart logic, the pattern language. So that to me feels like the more interesting question. Where is the bias living? There is a little bit of history here too, though I want to stay really careful with this. I don't think that the strongest way to say this is to suggest that knitting was designed for right-handed people from the onset. That feels too neat, too tidy, maybe even too easy, and also just off in its own way. What seems more likely, and based on things that I have gathered, is that knitting was a practiced skill long before written conventions fully developed around it. And then later, patterns and charts were developed to describe the standard working direction of what was already in use. So instead of saying that the craft itself is inherently right-handed, I think it makes more sense to say that written instructions and conventions became more standardized around one dominant orientation. And once that happens, anyone working outside of that orientation has more adapting and translation to do. And that's not unique to knitting either. Left-handed people have been dealing with versions of this forever. Tools, desks, scissors, handwriting, even the language around handedness itself often carries a right-handed bias. I was a teacher formerly, and I had to create lots of accommodations for my left-handed students so that they could work efficiently with the materials that were provided to them, because it was so rare to have left-handed scissors in the classrooms, notebooks that accommodated left-handed writers, pens if they had to use pens that didn't smear under their hands, all kinds of things that even my husband today deals with. And so left-handed folks are constantly confronted with the fact that things are created and put into the world with a very obvious right-handed bias. There's some really interesting statistics out there too about the danger of being left-handed that my husband will joke about sometimes, but I can tell he's actually quite serious. And it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down. If you are left-handed, you probably know this. This is obviously not just a knitting thing, but it shows up here as well because we're working with our hands. Okay, I digress. Let's keep going. Okay, I think one reason why this topic can become so confusing is that people hear handedness and immediately think of writing. And that makes sense. Writing is a very dominant hand-coded activity, unless of course you're ambidextrous. One hand is doing the fine motor work. The other hand is there to just mostly keep the paper from flying away. Knitting does not really behave that way. Both hands are involved the whole time. One hand is holding the stitches, one is helping form new ones. The yarn has to be managed somewhere. The needles have to be controlled. The work is coordinated. So that would suggest that knitting is much more a two-handed skill than a single-handed skill, which means that handedness doesn't really come into play in the same way that it does for something like writing. As I was reading through some of the experiences of left-handed knitters over on Reddit, because I went down the same Reddit rabbit hole that my viewer did, what stood out to me was not consensus. It was variation. Some left-handed knitters seem to be perfectly comfortable knitting in the current standard direction. And this is the same for my sister-in-law and my friend, who are both left-handed individuals, but they are knitting in the standard orientation from the right needle to the left needle. Some mirror knit. Some hold the yarn in the left hand and some hold the yarn in the right hand. Some don't even experience knitting as especially handed at all, meaning they don't recognize any dominance one way or the other. So the more I read, the more I realized that the phrase left-handed knitting was doing too much work, which is not exactly rare on the internet. Okay, from what I can tell, people are often using the phrase left-handed knitting to mean one of three things. The first one is holding the yarn in the left hand. And that's just what it means. Some people knit and they're holding the working yarn in the left hand as opposed to the right. And a lot of people would suggest that that's just more comfortable for left-handed knitters, which would also suggest that the dominant motion or the dominant activity in the overall process of knitting is yarn management. Fair enough. If it works for somebody, it works for somebody, and that's what matters most. But the overall structure of knitting in this case is not reversed. The stitches are still traveling from the left needle on to the right needle, and the pattern itself does not suddenly need to be mirrored. In this particular instance, this is based solely on yarn management, the management happening by the left hand. Then you have a left-handed person knitting in what would be considered the standard orientation. And that's all it is in that case. It's just knitting and the person happens to be left-handed. And then you could say it's right-handed knitting if they're knitting and they happen to be right-handed. Nothing different or out of the ordinary of the standard orientation is happening in this particular instance. The stitches are moving from the right needle to the left needle. Yarn management is happening in the right hand. You could refer to this as English style, and everything moves forward in that format. Now, that doesn't prove anything universally or objectively, obviously, but it does line up with a lot of what I was reading, which is that being left-handed does not automatically mean that that person needs a completely altered version of the craft. And then you have the next one, which is mirror knitting. Now, this is a relatively new concept to me. It's one I've only heard about, but up until this person left me this message, I dug a little bit deeper, and now I am more aware of, and it's really fascinating.
I'm going to mirror knit, instead of purling in this case, across the row this way. So I get myself set up, empty needle in my left hand, and I'm going to go through essentially the back loop of this stitch like this. Wrap it and pull it through.
This is a real thing. It is valid. It works and nobody needs to call the authorities. However, it does come with setup requirements. This is the point where pattern translation becomes more relevant and important. If you don't translate a pattern fully, you might have decreases slanting the wrong direction, cable directions may reverse, charts may need to be read differently. Pattern instructions are going to need more active interpretation. So from what I'm gathering, this is where the phrase left-handed knitting starts carrying more actual structural consequences. And that matters because it's not the same thing as simply being left-handed and knitting. So does a left-handed knitter need to mirror their knitting patterns? From everything I've read, the cleanest answer seems to be not necessarily. Certainly not by default. A left-handed person does not have to assume from the jump that they need to mirror patterns or reverse the entire logic of knitting just because they are left-handed. Some do choose mirror knitting because it feels more natural to them, and that is completely legitimate, and they absolutely don't need me to say so. So what seems most useful to say here is that mirror knitting is an option, not an automatic requirement. And I think this is probably the most reassuring thing a beginner could hear. You can try the standard direction. You can see how it feels, and you can decide from there. You do not need to begin your knitting life living under the impression that you have been assigned some additional administrative burden. So if I had to say where the right-handed bias seems most evident, based on everything that I've read and what I know about knitting mechanics, I would not say it lives most cleanly in the needles themselves. I would say it shows up more clearly in the conventions built around standard knitting, the chart direction, the pattern logic, the directional assumptions based on shaping. That seems to be where true mirror knitters start paying a tax, so to speak. Not because they're doing knitting wrong, but because the written system was standardized around a different default. That to me seems like the clearest place where any kind of handed bias becomes most visible. So, is left-handed knitting actually a thing? Kind of. But from what I can tell, the more useful answer is that knitting itself seems less rigidly handed than that phrase makes it sound. The bigger complication shows up in the conventions built around standard knitting, especially for folks who truly mirror the direction of the work. So I do think there is something real here. I just don't think it's as simple as saying that knitting is either left-handed or right-handed. But I would really love to hear from other left-handed knitters on this topic. If you knit left-handed, what does that mean to you? Or if you are left-handed and you knit in the standard direction, what has your experience actually been? And if you teach knitting, I would be especially curious to know whether or not students struggle with the motion itself. Which motion is it that they tend to find most complicated or most difficult because of what they would consider their handedness? Or is it less about the motion and more about the pattern conventions or the language around the whole thing? Thank you guys for hanging out with me today while I dig into this. This was fun. I love digging into questions. I love digging into what I call the tip line. You can email me at woolneedleshands@gmail.com if you have questions or if you have ideas of topics you would like me to explore. Thank you folks. Happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.